Good morning. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today. Before I hand you over to our speaker this morning, I'd love to cover off a few housekeeping items. We'd really like to hear from you. Feel free to type into the Q&A box and we'll cover as many questions as possible at the end of the session. If you'd like to ask your question live, please use the raised hand button and you can pose your question directly to Jean later this morning. One final note, we are recording the session today and we'll make it available to you all within the next 24 hours. With that, I'll now pass you over to Jean.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us this morning at LBS Partners. So this morning, I'm going to talk to you about a few things that we have learned in the last couple of months, maybe the last couple of years, but it's accelerating. And take you through our thinking on lean transformations or digital transformations more correctly. So what I'd like to begin with is just take you through what we believe is really happening in the world, in the business world and in the world of digitalization. I'll cover briefly the significance to ourselves and what it means, because I want all of you to understand what it means first, and then you can think about what it might mean to your organization. Then we'll move on to talking about how you might begin to put digital at the core of your strategy. And I think it's an imperative you will have to. Hopefully, I'll convince you some way towards that if you're not already convinced. We'll show you just some examples of what we have been doing in the early parts of our journey, because we really think we're at the early parts. I'll give you some pointers on first steps on getting on the journey. And then, as Kate said, we'll have some questions and answers with trepidation, because I'm not sure I'll be able to answer all of them, but we'll see. So just moving on then to what's really happening. So I just want to take you back a little bit in time. So a number of years ago, dotted around the country, we had these extra vision shops. Now at the time, they were quite modern and they were serving a very interesting entertainment for all of our families, children or whatever at the time. But they're no longer there really. They have been surpassed by Netflix. Now, Netflix, as you all know, have really just taken advantage of the technology. They're a completely digital company and there's no need for the likes of Extravision DVDs or anything anymore. An industry just gone practically overnight in some respects. Another one I'd like to talk about, again, ones you'll all be familiar with. Back in the day, we had local bookshops. We still do, and we still love perusing them. But Amazon, a number of years ago, decided to take on the bookshops with the new digital technology that was available. Very quickly, Amazon realized that nobody else had the kind of technology that they needed to make all the publications available, I suppose, to everybody. So they began to build their own technology. Now, interestingly, the technology that they began to build for them to compete digitally became known as Amazon Web Services. And that company, Amazon Web Services, has provided most of the profit that they have plowed into the growth of the company. And in effect, their future competitors are paying them to host their websites, and they'll probably be competing with Amazon down the way. So it's a scary thought how they've really taken advantage of the technology that's available. And then maybe we just look at one that's closer to home. A number of years ago, we would have used travel agents to book our full package holidays as we knew it then, maybe to the southern coast of Spain or the Canaries or somewhere. And they provided the flights, the hotels, they gave you some advice as to where the Irish pub was or whatever. So they give the whole package and you didn't have to worry about it. But they practically don't exist anymore. Ryanair, founded in 1984, struggled a little bit at the start, and then during the 90s really took on that low-cost model. If I think back to when we began to book Ryanair flights, we were actually using the travel agents. Then they had us booking them through call centers, and not long after that, we were booking them on computers. In 2000, they launched their website, and then their digital journey really began in earnest. And actually, it was in 2006 or thereabouts, they decided to take away the check-ins. We were printing our own boarding passes and taking them straight to the gate. And then by 2009, check-in desks were gone. And after that, they continued on. But you can see what they've done. So those three lessons are stark reminders to us as to what can happen, whole industries. Now, it doesn't happen immediately overnight, but it happens fairly quickly over a number of years. So we need to make sure that we're thinking correctly about it, and we can learn from the lessons of those poor people that were on the left of those slides. So really, we've a choice. We could be the bystanders watching what's going on, or we could get on this wave that's coming after us and have a bit of a fun and a bit of a blast on it. That's the opportunity that's open to us. So if I just then move on, I said I wanted to talk briefly about the significance to you. So I'm going to just take you to two companies that should be familiar to nearly everybody. Boeing and Airbus, who make all the airplanes that we travel in these days. They had and still have very complicated value chains that they compete with. And maybe I'll look at Airbus in a little bit more detail. It's just closer to us and a little more familiar. So Airbus make these very complicated airplanes. In fact, Airbus make the final airplane in Toulouse, but a lot of the parts are manufactured throughout Europe. The wings are made in Wales, for example. The tails are made in Germany. Stabilizers are made down in Spain at the back of the aircraft, and so on. So all those Airbus sites are really organizations bringing parts together for that final assembly. And then in the third level down in their supply chain, you have nearly 10,000 suppliers. I was counting them there for the purposes of putting this together. And I picked out even the Irish ones. You think of BS&B there, make some parts for Airbus that go to one of the Airbus sites that go into the ultimate airplane. And they probably have suppliers in that fourth tier below that. But it's a very complicated set of transactions that are going on to organize the schedules and the manufacture and certification of all of these parts to get into a final airplane. Huge amount of industry just in the transactions that are going on behind the scenes. That's the way we have competed up until now. But something has been happening in the last number of years. In some industries, it's been happening over a couple of decades. And I'll go back to one that, again, should be fairly familiar to us. And that is the providers of our, what we used to call landlines. I suppose we don't talk about them that much anymore. But in the old days, Telecom Éireann were our network provider. They provided all of the exchanges and the copper lines that were buried in the ground that brought the telephone service to our homes. They also provided the handset, and they charged a rental on that handset every month inside your bill. And then finally, they, as I say, they also did the billing for us. So here's an interesting little thought for you. Back in 1996, Telecom Éireann would have charged £6.67 for a 10-minute call to the United States during business hours. And then a couple of years later, in 1999, that had reduced to £2.99. Well, you all know what it costs now. So then if I could just talk about what that has begun to morph into in front of our eyes. So Telecom Éireann, that network part is still provided by the company Air. I know they provide some other things as well, but they provide that infrastructure to us. Then your handset, well, I don't really know where you'd buy a handset for a landline these days, but Philips is the last one I probably remember that you might have been able to get one from, but Sony and the likes. And then the operator these days, even for your landline, could be the likes of Vodafone. So that value stream, that value chain that they owned as a monopoly in the past has now really broken down into these separate areas, and they compete quite differently, as you're probably well aware. But I'll move on to how data is provided to us today through the whole cellular data network that we use for our phones and for the broadband 4G, soon to be 5G. At this very bottom layer, as I've described here, so if you remember, we were competing in vertical layers in the past, but what's begun to happen now is the marketplaces are beginning to change into these horizontal layers. And Air, 3 and Vodafone have masts and infrastructure around the country to provide the actual service of moving data about. Then the people that sell us the packages, well, you could be buying it from Sky or Virgin Media, Pure Telecom or somebody like that. But very interestingly, at the top of this, there's a whole new layer of innovation going on and a whole new set of services. It's really industries in their own right, Netflix, Sky, Spotify, and others. So what's happening really is at this bottom layer where the infrastructure is provided, they compete based on scale. They have a huge amount of scale. There'll never be that many of them. And as long as they keep improving the technology, they'll keep competing. Then at the middle layer, people bundle up, they buy wholesale, I suppose, from those providers, and they offer services to us. And it's very competitive in there. They're competing mainly on price and probably not a great customer satisfaction as we're hearing these days. And then finally, where all the action is really happening is up here in this top layer. So the markets are changing from these traditional vertical silos into these layers. And we really need to think about our organizations and our businesses in terms of what part we're playing in and we will be playing in the future. And an awful lot of the value is migrating towards that top layer. So we need to pay a lot of attention to that. I want to just change tack for a couple of minutes now. And sorry about this, I'll probably bring you back to some of your school days. But I want to introduce just the idea of exponential. And we've heard a lot about exponential growth of curves and things from the health people in the last couple of months. I want to go back to exponential and just remind everybody what that means. Apologies if it's very familiar to everybody, but I found myself that while I understood the concept, bringing it back into what's happening in business and the likes takes a bit of mental agility. So the story goes that a long time ago, an emperor in China was brought the game of chess by one of his subjects. And he was very impressed with the game and he asked his subject what he'd like in return. The subject thought about it and the answer he gave was, look, if you could give me 1 grain of rice for the first square on the chessboard, 2 grains for the second, 4 for the third, and onwards until you get to the 64th square, I'd be very happy. So the number that it ends up at, I'll let you think about it for a minute what it might be, but I couldn't even pronounce or didn't know how you would pronounce a number like this. The number is 9 quintillion, 223 quadrillion, 372 trillion, 36 billion, 854 million, 775,808 grains of rice. So these are numbers that are incomprehensible to us. But what has been going on in the technology world has been increasing at exponential rates. So we need to understand really what's that going to do to us, what's it doing to us, what has it done to those people in the past. So really need you to pause and think about what exponential means. So often on the curves, we might see it like this, that we're living in this linear type world, and that's very familiar to us because most of what goes on around us is kind of linear or slight acceleration, but it's not really exponential. Exponential is where things really take off. And we're seeing it with some of the huge organizations, sometimes referred to as the FANGs, the Facebooks, Apples, Amazons, networks, Googles, that are operating in these kind of huge scales, that they have billions, millions or billions of users and billions of hits and things, you know, staggering numbers. But we need to think about it because we can take advantage of some of that. So a couple of ideas I'd like to introduce you to. You probably have heard something about this Moore's law. It's touted an awful lot when people are thinking about technology. And it's really a rule of thumb. Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders of Intel, observed that the power of computing doubles roughly 18 months. But there's a couple of other things going on in technology as well. This guy, Jerry Butter, observed that the amount of data that they can get through fiber optics is doubling every 9 months. So the communication of information is doubling every 9 months. And then finally, there's this law of storage called Kreider's law that observed that storage density doubles annually. So those 3 things are really exponential improvements in the technology that are happening all the time. This guy, Solow, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, observed also that during 1980 to 2015, the investment in technology grew by 20 times, but the GDP of nations in the world grew by a factor of 3. So we're spending an awful lot more on the technology, but we don't seem to be getting the benefit that you would expect. So that's pause for thought. How do we take advantage of all of this new technology? Now, I also want to introduce you to a slightly different way of thinking about the organization of a business. It isn't the only definition, but just for the purposes of this thinking, think of a business as an organization that's there to complete transactions. All the transactions in between all of those people, if you remember Airbus, all those different organizations all have invoices and statements and payments, transactions. But even within every one of those organizations, there are lots of transactions between two parties. So this idea that a transaction is agreement between two parties to exchange goods or services and more information. So every time you read an email or have a meeting or go on a webinar, there's a transaction going on, be it information or services or goods are moving around all the time. So think of a business as lots and lots of transactions. And we'll come back to it later, but really what's happening is that the cost of those transactions and what we can achieve with those transactions is improving greatly. The cost of them is really heading towards zero. And that's what we need to focus on. So now I just want to talk for a couple of minutes about why digital must be at the core of your strategy. So I've talked about that business development, and our world is kind of this linear navy curve here. And while there's this exponential evolution of technology, so the innovative startups are jumping in there and they're taking advantage of that. So that growth and that capability from the technology is unleashing endless opportunity for us if we know how to take advantage of it. We need to be very aware that our minds are biased more towards the more linear things that we're familiar with. Everything around us is that more linear way of thinking about it. And these innovative startups are challenging their antecedents. So they'll really be challenging us if we don't get our own houses in order first. And we have to remember that because we have been around a while in our organizations, we have built up all the older ways of doing things. So it's harder for us to change to the new technologies, much harder than it is for a startup to start up in the new ways. So just a couple of numbers here I'll just touch on briefly. Harvard Business Review would reckon that digital leaders outperform the laggards in all of the important metrics, customer loyalty, and ultimately revenue growth. And Boston Consulting Group would have noted that technology adopters lead the laggards by 13% in yearly revenue growth. That means that if they did nothing else other than be leaders in adopting technology, they would be twice the size of their competitors over a 6-year period. You can see there that nearly all the boards of organizations are investing more in the technology, but the leaders of organizations think that culture is a big barrier, and yet 50% of employees think that leaders don't think about culture as a priority. So you can see there's mismatches going on everywhere in terms of how we're set up in our organizations. So what's really happening is that the markets that are available to us, the amount of innovation that we can do now with all of the capability and technology, and the speed of change and the speed of technology are all increasing towards infinity, I suppose, on that exponential curve. And at the same time, the cost of doing transactions within our organizations is decreasing effectively towards zero. So we really need to understand how to take advantage of that huge reduction in transaction cost. And of course, keep an eye on how we go to market, because we may have to go to market very differently than we did. So we need to keep those two ideas at the center of our strategy. So I was fortunate to be at a very interesting presentation given by Richard from Google, Richard Surter from Google, at a Lean Business Ireland conference a number of weeks ago. And Richard introduced this very useful definition of a digital transformation. So he said a digital transformation is continuous customer-focused efficiency and innovation powered by software. He talked a lot about the culture and the people, and I just added it into his definition for the sake of completeness. So what I want to do is just go through Richard's ideas very briefly on what each of those means. So by continuous, he means that we should be making things happen very regularly, every day, every week, every month, not so much every year, like the idea of annual planning or having these very long project rollouts. They're old ideas. We need to get much closer to doing it every day. By customer focused, he talks about bringing the customer into every conversation in your organization. When you're talking about processes or products and how you serve the customer, make sure that you're thinking about the customer, and even that the interactions between people in an organization are very customer focused. So that empathy for customers is very important. He suggests identifying 2 or 3 measures of success that are customer focused and making those very central to your organization. When he talks about efficiency, he talks about the processes that we have used in the past are very dense. We need to figure out how to make them much lighter and flow much more easily for everybody working in the organizations. So the days of these big, strong, robust SOPs, we need to think about those, make them much simpler bits of videos to explain things to people, and simpler processes are the order of the day. And particularly optimizing the path by which value flows to customers. When Richard talks about innovation, he talks about thinking more in terms of that product and the service we provide for the customer and how we rapidly make that service available. And when he talks about software, he talks about taking advantage of the technologies and, most importantly, making sure that we learn the capabilities for technology in the future, and to make sure all of our organizations are equipped with those. And lastly, we must remember to make sure that all of our organizations are a learning type organization, that we're curious and embracing all of that technology that's available to us. So I think that's a very useful way of thinking about how we should be transforming the organization. And really, from everything I have seen and read and experienced, most of this is about how we think about it. It's not, you don't need to worry too much about the technology. You do need to think about the culture and how well you can adopt all of this great technology that's becoming available to us. So we're faced with almost a 3-card trick, a dilemma. We could be like Netflix, or you could be like Netflix. You could go completely digital. That's probably unlikely. You could be like some of those bystanders or like Extravision. You could be left behind if you're not careful. But most likely you'll need to do something, and you'll be in this bit in the middle. You'd be like the Amazons or the Ryanairs, where you have a product with a firm foot in the traditional linear world, but you'll have a whole organization that's very much thinking about the digital world. I think myself that you really need to really have 2 halves of your brain thinking digital and thinking undigital, because some parts of your organization will be undigital. Now, I was trying to figure out, could you call that linear? Could you call it traditional? Could you call it analog? I think we'd be better off just almost coining this new phrase and saying there's stuff that's digital and there's stuff that's undigital. And we really need to tackle the undigital like it's waste, unless it truly is adding value for customers. So now I'd just like to show you for a couple of minutes some of the little bits and pieces we've been doing within LBS Partners as we begin to wrestle with our own digital transformation journey.
Our digital journey started well before we even knew it had. We have made 4 separate iterations of our website to appeal to our customers and provide a better experience for visitors to our website. Our latest website, which will be highly interactive and digital, will launch in January 2021. Our means of communication has moved from newspaper and publishing to highly digital in the form of LinkedIn, where we can target customers with specific ads of our choice. Our events are now held digitally, People can attend our various conferences from their own offices and avoid the need for travel. Our reach has substantially increased as a result. All our training is now available on a blended basis. Our resources are all available via SharePoint to our student cohort. There are options available at multiple levels, and this will all be further improved with the launch of our LMS system in early 2021. All our company information is now housed in the cloud for easy access to all our employees. Our sales meeting have moved to very accurate, timed, agended meetings every Friday, where we have a visual of all our sales opportunities and how they move through the pipeline. These meetings can be held virtually or in person. This has brought more efficiency to our meetings since we were using manual boards and various forms of handwriting. Dashboards now give us very clear information on our planning, and our new product development has now moved to a highly digital format. Each new product goes through a pipeline and through various gates. We look at each product visually and identify where it's moving, what's the next steps, making sure that it all moves accordingly. This has been our digital journey so far. The journey continues.
So it's strange in a way, but that happened over a number of years. When you see it all compressed like that, it seems like an awful lot, but all those steps are being put in place over a period of time. And believe me, we have a lot of steps in front of us for the future. So I just want to then talk about what steps you might want to take or what would be appropriate. So at level 1, just the basics, just almost to get yourself ready, we'd recommend 8 things that should be looked at. First of all, the organizational awareness, particularly the leadership of the organization, probably some of yourselves that are on this call this morning. The organizational awareness, what are we doing? Where are all the opportunities for digital innovation to happen? Number 2, what's the capability of the team to begin the change required? Do we have the skills or do we need to look for them elsewhere? You probably do have them in the organization when you look. A good check of the state of your technology assets, the computers and the things you're using. Are they really able to keep up with the technology? Remember those rates of change I was talking about? Think about that exponential. We really do have to be revamping the technologies on a regular basis. As Richard Serter had described, we really need to have a very good understanding of the customer experience and what the customer expectation is now, because their expectations have changed enormously because they're using a lot of this technology in their daily lives and their personal lives as much as at work. We need to think about how your organizations manage information on the internet, how your website looks, but you may have other channels of communication, service channels and the likes, or information about the product that you need to be very careful that is very consistent and it's done well. The management of all your digital communications then, because people can be chatting about you on social media and the likes, as you probably well know. Then how you collect and manage business information to run the business. That's very, very important. And then finally, and we're hearing a lot about threats and where the Department of Justice and others in America and Microsoft and the Big Five and everybody were attacked by a cyber attack there last week. You need to think about the security of your data and your information and the backups. So we've put together a small scorecard to help you answer some questions. In all, we have about 60 questions on that. We're going to make it live on a website in January. And in the meantime, we'll be doing a phase 2 trials of that. So if any of you wanted to sign up for a kind of a trial, we'd be delighted to have you. Maybe we do that pilot in the first 2 weeks of January, and then we'll be launching the full website later. So you can send your interest to Kate at info@lbspartners.ie if you're interested in helping us with that pilot. And as I say, we hope to go live with that to help you with just the basics. But if I move on from that then, at the next level, and this is where it begins to really get interesting, is you need to start putting together a vision for your future digital world. So to do that, you need to think about all of the different activities that go on in your business, all of the transactions that happen, and start capturing how they happen, be they meetings, reviews, analysis, chats, recording of information. Every one of these transactions is really an opportunity for digitalization. And I think you should classify those into transactions that could be eliminated. They may no longer be necessary. They could be completely automated. They could be partially automated, or maybe at this point in time, no action is practical and it might wait for future technology or might not be possible at all. In classifying each of these, a bit like the waste in lean, we need to think about the accuracy of our data. We need to think about the effort that's required to generate that data and the ease of automating it, because if it's too difficult to automate it, we probably shouldn't try just yet. So the big takeaway here really is to create a future plan for every transaction. Now, I'll show you just this is a messy map. This is where we were gathering information, or how we would gather information for a client. We have little logos there that are showing you the different applications that this client was using. But I want to draw your attention to just, we were taking notes as to what would have to happen, but there are 4 systems that this client's using. And they were scheduling some of their workforce to do service calls. They have timesheets to keep a record of the hours that were spent with the clients. They have software to do the payroll, and then they have QuickBooks to manage the accounts. Now they have 4 separate solutions, all good in their own right, but they should really be all knitted together. It should be one flow of data, but they're actually managing 4 systems. So that's all happening within here. Fabulous opportunity. Once we make it visible and see what's going on in it, it's much easier to think about how to put it together in the future. We've put together just a more structured map of our own systems. Now, all the interactions of these systems aren't shown on this diagram, but just to give you an idea as to what we're doing, and you saw a lot of it in the video, we're using Microsoft Planner to help us with the design of new courses and new consulting offerings. We depend extensively on our website and LinkedIn for marketing, where our sales and managing projects is done. We depend very heavily on Salesforce, and that's really our enterprise system that ties it all together. And that's connected very closely with QuickBooks so that we can do clear invoicing at the end of the month. In fulfilling our consulting and our training, we're using Zoom and Miro, the software we used for that diagram on the previous slide. We're beginning to use Microsoft Business Analytics for all of our own internal metrics. And then even when we're in recruitment mode, we use LinkedIn to do the hiring, but we also use an online behavioral profiling to help us with the hiring. In the facilities, I just put it in here to mention, we have both broadband landline coming into our offices, but we also have a backup on a Vodafone network, so that we can be sure that we can keep operating at all times. And then finally, as you saw in the little video clip earlier, we use SharePoint very extensively to tie a lot of our communications together. Now, we still have huge work to do. We still depend on email an awful lot and would like to get our transactions off email quite a bit and into these systems more and more. Just gives you an idea. And at the next level then, I want you to think, we're pretty ready at this stage to think about your own system, whatever it is. I just have a couple of examples here, but there are many enterprise resource planning systems. You need to think about those and how fit they are for purpose. Just recently, I was talking to some people from SAP, and they were talking about their biggest difficulty is they're seen as this big, almost old-fashioned ERP system, whereas really they have very modern offerings that are completely cloud-based, that are useful for very small businesses. But you need to really kind of reinvent how you're going to use all of these systems. And the takeaway really here again is the same kind of process, but it's much more complicated because it's so many interdependencies in the big system. And now briefly, I just want to quickly take you through if you have to change how you go to market, how you compete, then there are 4 drivers of competitive advantage, 5 ways to compete, and 10 places to start. And I'd just like to go through these pretty quickly with you. So I'll explain these by way of example. The first driver, well, Google Maps is probably the best way to describe it. Google depend on us having a network of devices. So almost all of us have a device that we're driving around with in our car. And Google depend on the information from that to tell them what's going on with traffic all over the road networks. So they depend on that network for them to provide the value. And if we didn't have those devices, they couldn't give us the traffic information. Another one, Google bought YouTube a good number of years ago, and that's a winner kind takes all strategy, where they really became the ubiquitous provider of short video and video online, and it was the go-to place, and they really eclipsed the market for a good number of years. A third way is to create a platform for people to compete on. Facebook did this very well and grew to be the giant that they are. And when they saw some competition that might be new platforms that could take over, rather than let them compete, they just bought them, WhatsApp and Instagram. And I suppose particularly the European regulators aren't too happy with that, but I think none of us are right now with the power that they can wield. And then finally, a slightly more comfortable one is look at the likes of Ryanair and what they did with complementary capabilities. They had this whole engine, this digital engine that was providing the flights or whatever else, so it was easy for them to add on complementary capabilities like hotels and car hire. So those are four ways to consider, four ideas to consider how you could get some competitive advantage. Now, there's 5 other ways you can think about competing, and Paddy Power uses data. They create hundreds of thousands of bets every Friday, Saturday, using the statistics and the data from all their users, and they've become very sophisticated. You can bet on what player is going to score next, what player is going to get a yellow card first, any number of bets. Think of innovation then, I think of Spotify, because they very subtly keep adding features all the time to keep them ahead of any kind of competition that's coming behind them in terms of how useful their service is. A third one is, well, you could compete on the good old cost, quality and time. And the journal.ie set up to do this very, very effectively. They weren't encumbered with all of the old presses and the old thinking of the newspapers they compete with. They get their news out very quickly in short, digestible bits for us. And they're a very credible service as a result. A lot of you may be familiar with Revolut, that provides value by way of having a very simple way for us to transact, to move our money. We don't have to depend on the banks, and they have all these extra features like splitting a bill in a restaurant or loaning money to a friend, or indeed I think you can buy shares on Revolut these days. So they're bringing a whole new set of value to us. And then a fifth one that I'd just like to point out to you, Deliveroo or Uber Eats or Just Eat, they've managed to insert themselves between the restaurants and takeaways and the customers, so that they're the place we go to. And that's how they're adding value, is by that ease of which we could book the food from any restaurant or from multiple restaurants, and they'll bring it all to us at the same time. So I'm not suggesting that you change your whole business to compete on one of these, but the 9 of those ideas should give you ideas as to how you might be able to bring more value to your customers and begin to compete and add services or little bits of value for your customers. Now, finally, then, I just want to talk to you about where you might get started. I just want to give you a few ideas just very quickly. You could start with, as Richard Serter had talked to us, getting a customer understanding. Think about how customers interact with you and how you get that feedback. Simple feedback that they could give you would be a place to start, and getting a better understanding of the customers. You could, in some way, digitally modify the business and the interaction customers have with you. You could create a whole new business, like we've talked about some of those examples. Or you could just think about the new markets that are available to you as a result of this global digitalization. Over on the process side of things, well, you could think about how you generate business and how you need to use the digital assets, particularly websites and the likes, to grow your top line. You could also think of all the different touch points that customers have with you as a way of starting some parts of your digital journey. And you could think about the digitalization of the processes within your organization and all of those transactions I talked about earlier. We could think about worker enablement, how we could make it easier for people to do their jobs. Lots of ideas have come up since the pandemic has hit. And we could think about different digital capabilities we might be able to create within our organization. And they may not always be digital. They may be much easier ways of doing old capabilities with digital technology or digital assets. And then finally, think about the performance of your business and how you get all of the information to really know what's going on in the business and what's important. So those are 10 places you could start thinking about how could I digitalize some of the transactions there a little bit more. So I've taken you through those very quickly, and I just wanted to show you, I started earlier on talking about Aircom, and here's 100 years of change that has gone on in the telecommunications industry, and a lot of the change came to them first. But that all happened over 100 years, and there's a lot on it. God, you remember call cards, and you remember those old decked phones. You might even remember having a black Bakelite phone or the more modern plastic white one in a house a number of years ago. But it has changed so much. That happened over 100 years. There'll probably be as much innovation in the technology world in the next 2 to 3 years as there had been in that whole century. Will you be ready for it? So now, if there were one or two questions, maybe I could stop sharing and maybe see if I can answer any questions you might have.
Yes, we have a question in from Amy. So in your opinion, Jean, do you feel culture change has been a significant problem in digital transformation?
I think culture change will be the problem, and the speed at which we're able to unravel the processes and the habits that we have in organizations to take advantage of this technology will be the biggest stumbling block. And I think it was probably the thing that Solo was pointing out when he said the technology spend had been 20 times, but the adoption had been more like 3 times, that it really is our ability to change our habits and adopt will be the single biggest thing. So it's not the technology itself, it's how we get our organizations comfortable and curious about all this technology. That's really will be the difference between winners and losers, I think. You will also have to pay attention to the competitors coming at you, but the culture would probably be the single biggest thing in my opinion.
Great, thanks, Jean. I'm conscious we're coming up close on time, but if we have anyone else who'd like to ask a question, if you want to come on live and pose your question directly to Jean, you can click on the raise hand button and we can turn on your mic and you can chat with Jean directly.
Okay, well, hopefully I didn't lose you all in that. And I was kind of in trepidation that the questions might be way beyond me in terms of the technology itself. I hope you found that interesting. I certainly found it very interesting putting this presentation and webinar together for you this morning. And I certainly think differently about our business, particularly how to think in this new digital world about things being exponential, and particularly the cost of every transaction is going to zero. So we really need to figure out how to get the machines to do almost all those transactions and save the humans for the more important, curious innovation and moving into the future. And remember, everybody has all of this technology available to them throughout the world. So whoever adopts it first and fastest really is going to be successful. So look, there's nothing else for me to do other than to thank you all for joining me this morning and wish you all a very safe and happy Christmas. Thank you.
So thanks everyone for attending. We really, really appreciate you taking out the time this morning to listen in. Do feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions, or if you'd like any more information on anything we've discussed this morning, you can get us on info@lbspartners.ie. We will follow up with a recording of this session in the next 24 hours. And all that's left for me to say is hopefully we'll see you again at our next webinar. Merry Christmas.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.